The Secret of the Lost Tunnel, a Hardy Boys mystery story by Franklin W. Dixon. Chapter 1. Double Warning. The telephone in the Hardy Boy home rang sharply as the clock struck 4. Blonde-haired Joe bounded from the hall and took the call. "Fenton Hardy's residence," he said, in an answer to a query. "My father isn't home. Will you leave a message?" "This is Dr. Bush," the man informed him in a deep voice. "You are going to have a visitor. Watch your step and pay no attention to his story. He's dangerous. He's out of his mind." The man spoke a few seconds longer and then hung up abruptly. Puzzled, Joe returned to the living room. "What's the matter?" asked his dark-haired brother Frank, who was a year older. "A General Smith is coming here. Dr. Bush, who just phoned, said that the general's crazy and that we should pay no attention to him." Before Joe had a chance to explain further, the telephone rang again. He answered it. "Hello?" Placing his hand over the mouthpiece, he whispered to Frank, "A woman. Says she knows Dr. Bush." Then into the instrument, he said, "Yes, yes. Why? Hello? Hello?" The click on the other end of the line was evidence that the woman had ended the conversation. "Who was she?" Frank inquired. "Didn't give her name," Joe replied. "But listen to this. She said that if we heard from a Dr. Bush, we should call the police immediately." "Good night!" Frank exclaimed. "A mystery to solve before we even see the people involved in it." But puzzling situations were nothing new to the brothers. As the sons of Bayport's famous detective Fenton Hardy, they'd encountered many baffling cases, the beginning with the Tower treasure, and their most recent adventure, the sign of the crooked arrow. Frank and Joe had successfully concluded an intriguing mystery. Now the boys' thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of the front doorbell. Joe opened the door. Before him stood a man in the uniform of the United States Army. On his shoulder he wore a single star of Brigadier General. "I'm General Smith," he said. "I'd like to see Mr. Hardy." "Step in, please," Joe said politely. He shot a quick glance at Frank and then surveyed the stranger carefully. The general, whether mentally unbalanced or not, had all the bearing of a fine military man. He was of medium build and stocky, with a ruddy complexion, blue eyes, and red hair. "My father's not here," Frank told him. "Well, that's too bad. How is he?" "Why, very well," Frank replied. "Wonderful man," General Smith commented. "You know him?" Joe asked. "Surely. I came to speak to your father on a very important matter." "We could give him your message," Frank offered. "I'm Frank, and this is my brother Joe. Dad's been away. We expect him back sometime today." General Smith walked into the living room and seated himself in Fenton Hardy's favorite club chair, looking keenly at the boys. "I'll relate my story briefly," the man said. "You can tell your father, in case he doesn't get back before I return to Washington. It concerns a treasure buried in the Civil War. I want him to find it." Joe stole a glance at Frank. His brother looked as puzzled as he did as the man continued. "My great-grandfather, a Confederate general," he said, "was disgraced during the Civil War because he lost a bandolier containing a special cap box made of silver." "A bandolier?" Joe asked. "Yes, a military shoulder strap. Today they contain cartridges. But the old one that my great-grandfather lost carried a small silver box, which was a family heirloom." "What was so disgraceful about losing that?" Frank asked as he observed the man intently. "The box contained no bullets," the general explained, "but it did hold a secret, which has remained unsolved to this day. You see, just before a certain battle, my great-grandfather called at the plantation of his cousin, Beauregard Smith, a wealthy planter and the president of the local bank. Beauregard confided to my great-grandfather that if the enemy troops got too close, he intended to bury his gold, together with that belonging to the bank. What happened then? Joe put in eagerly. The man moved uneasily in his chair. Just before the Battle of the Rocky Run, he went on, an old slave from Beauregard Smith's plantation ran into great-grandfather's headquarters. He handed him a sealed envelope moments before dropping dead from exhaustion. As the visitor stopped speaking, he sprang from the chair and paced rapidly toward the door. What's he going to go do now? Frank wondered, recalling the telephone warning. But the general turned sharply on his heel and walked back, continuing his story. Great-grandfather only had a chance to glance at it. The message. It contained a series of numbers. It sounds crazy, I know. Joe gulped and looked at his feet. Across the face of the message, the general proceeded, were the letters CSA. But before great-grandfather could study the numbers, scouts brought reports of the enemy's approach, and great-grandfather had to issue a call to arms. He hurriedly hid the message in the ammunition box. The opposing signs joined in battle shortly afterward, and the fight continued into the night. In the darkness and confusion, the bandolier and the cap box disappeared, and with them the secret. Didn't Beauregard Smith remember the message he had sent? Frank asked. The general stared absently at the boy, and then went on. He was killed defending his plantation. The place was cannonaded and burned to the ground. The general began to pace again. Beauregard Smith's family was penniless, and in disgrace, too, because the bank's gold was lost. They accused my great-grandfather of taking it for his own use. Joe gave a whistle. That's some accusation. At the moment, the telephone rang again, startling the general and the boys. Frank leapt to answer. The caller was Dr. Bush. Has Smith arrived? He asked abruptly. Hold on a moment, Frank said. In the silence that followed, Frank strained to hear any familiar sound that might identify the place from which the doctor was calling. In a second, he was rewarded. The words, "two on a raft," were boomed in the distance. It was the voice of Pete at Shorty's diner. Frank beckoned to Joe and whispered, Bush is at Shorty's diner. I'll try to keep him talking while you get a look at him. Joe raced from the house and hopped into his brother's convertible. He drove speedily toward Shorty's diner, located a few blocks away, in the downtown section of Bayport. Reaching it, he hastily parked, bounded up the front steps, and pushed open the door. As the tempting aroma of sizzling hamburgers and coffee drifted to Joe's nostrils, he glanced quickly toward the telephone booth at the end of the long counter. It was empty. Slowly, a rotund youth sitting on a stool swung around. In his hand, he held a triple-decker sandwich. "Hello, Joe," he said. "What's the big hurry?" "Chet!" Joe exclaimed. "Did you see anybody come out of that phone booth a second ago?" "Don't rush me," Chet pleaded, and bit into the sandwich. Chet Morton, a pal of the Hardys, enjoyed eating and did not like to be hurried while engaged in his favorite pastime. Joe was bursting with impatience as he watched Chet chew contentedly on the big mouthful. "This is awful important," Joe pleaded. "Not another bite now." He repeated the question. Chet gulped, patted his lips with a white paper napkin, and said, "Sure, I saw the guy. Came out of the booth so fast that he bumped into me. And I said, 'Look, mister, you almost knocked the sandwich out of my—' For Pete's sake, Chet, cut out the gab. Where did he go?" The stout boy wheeled around on the stool and pointed to the side door. "That-a-way. What's up, Joe? I'll tell you later." Joe raced through the door, then halted on the sidewalk. Chet lumbered out after him. "I think that's him down the street there," Chet volunteered. He was tall and wore a dark suit, carried a black bag. Without a word, Joe sped after the figure, who was now a block away. The stranger glanced back and then broke into a trot. At that moment, a black sedan slowed up at the corner. The man hopped in. Before Joe could catch up with him, or get a look at the license plate, the car disappeared. Joe turned dejectedly as Chet arrived on the scene. "Didn't even get a good look at him," Joe moaned. "Is he a crook?" Chet asked, puffing. "Maybe. Anyway, somebody asked us to get the police after him. I just wish I hadn't lost him." "Don't worry, pal," Chet piped up. "I figured this was another detective case, so I've decided to help you." "How?" Joe blurted, a frown creasing on his forehead. "Surprise," Chet replied. And then for the first time, Joe noticed that his plump friend held an old camera in his hands. "I took his picture," Chet said proudly. End of Chapter 1.